There is a drone base in Crimea where the drones that the Iranians have given Russia are being launched from. There are command and control sites in Crimea that are essential for Russia's hold on all of the territory, including the land bridge. There are mass military installations on Crimea that Russia has turned into essential logistics and back office depots for this war. Those are legitimate targets. Ukraine is hitting them, and we are supporting that.
This is the number 2 person in the State Department of the United States. It's not Tony Blinken. It's not the secretary, obviously, purporting to justify, as I read it, an American attack on Crimea.
Well, it's a proxy American attack. What she's saying is that the United States is providing the support, both in terms of materiel, the weapons, and the intelligence, the targeting, to attack. But she's right. I mean, from a Ukrainian perspective, everything she laid out is a legitimate target. I mean, welcome to war. If Russia thinks that it can wage this conflict with Ukraine and not have these targets struck by Ukraine, that's another thing coming. But for the United States to come in and literally, a lawyer needs to review her words, Judge, because what she did.
That's the point. This is the number 2 or 3. I forget how they do the rankings. The number 2 or 3 person in the State Department of the United States with a smile from ear to ear, justifying the use of American military equipment, which we know means American military personnel, against a part of the world that has been Russia since Catherine the Great reigned over Russia, which was before George III reigned over the American colonies.
But it's not just that. Yes, we know the historical link, but she's basically saying straight up, America is a party to this conflict. Literally, she just said, we are a party to the conflict. And thank goodness the Russians aren't us. Because if there was a Russian Victoria Nuland, they'd say, well, every American base in Europe is now a target, and we are going to attack you.
That's my point. How dangerous is it for her to make a statement like this? Who knows if they ran this past the lawyers? Who knows if Tony Blinken approved it or had a heart attack when he heard about it? Whatever you think of him, he's a lot more nuanced than she is. I mean, this is reckless to the extreme, is it not?
Totally. Look, in the lead up to Desert Storm, there was an Air Force officer who spoke out about the air campaign. Nothing he said was factually wrong, but he spoke out in a way that put the Air Force in a bad light, put the United States in a bad light. He was fired the same day. Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, picked up the phone, called Colin Powell and said, fire him. And they did. Why? Because he doesn't get to make these policy decisions. She should be fired on the spot. Literally, she should be terminated, fired, kicked out. If what she's saying is American policy, okay, but that's unspoken policy. You can't commit the United States down the path that could lead inevitably to not just conflict, but nuclear conflict. She is dangerous, and she should be terminated in terms of her employment.
Could it have been a trial balloon?
Well, it's the silliest trial balloon I've ever seen, because it's a trial balloon that, to what end? It doesn't prove anything if Russia does nothing. It just means that Russia's, once again, demonstrating that they're the adult in the room. But then if Russia does something, then you're at war with Russia. Again, it's a horrible trial balloon.
All right. As we speak, it's the end of the day in Ukraine. The sun is setting. What is your understanding is the status of control and forces in Bakhmut?
The Russians continue to push forward. The Ukrainians continue to reinforce, and people keep dying. And at some point in time, I believe the Russians are going to capture Bakhmut, whether it's through an encirclement, whether it's through just grinding their way through, they'll capture it. And when that happens, as President Zelensky has accurately said, that will burst the Ukrainian defenses, and then we'll have the Russians. Right now, if you look at Bakhmut, you got a little bit of a bubble here from this encirclement, but it's basically a line. When it bursts, the Russians are going to be able to come in and take a lot of territory. That just elongated the front lines, the line of contact. Russia has the troops to man that area. Ukraine does not, which means that this bubble is going to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. That's why Bakhmut is so important. It is literally the Gordian knot that holds Ukrainian defenses together. And when it falls, you're going to see this ballooning.
the last time we spoke, actually the last two times we spoke, Scott, you were commenting that the Ukrainians are using ammunition faster than the West can supply it, faster than the West can manufacture it. Is that still the case? Because if it is, sooner or later, the number's going to go down to zero.
No, literally, there's nothing the West can do to change this. Literally nothing. Even if Joe Biden today woke up and said, "I'm going to sign, some War Powers Authority for defense production," we can't get the production lines up and running. We can't get the resources allocated. We can't get things off the production line to stop what is inevitably going to happen. Ukrainians will run out of ammunition sometime this summer, and when that happens, it's all over.
What is the status of the 300,000 to 500,000 reservists, veterans, conscripts, whatever you want to call them, the people that President Putin called up around September that have been training since then? Here we now are in March. Are they on the other side of that line that you talked about, or have they begun their assault into Ukraine?
Some are on the line of contact, putting the pressure on the Ukrainians. Because remember, when Bakhmut falls, this bubble begins. In order to man that, Ukraine's going to have to pull forces away from elsewhere, which thins those line out so you get more bubbles, and you're just going to see this percolation of bubbles along the line, bursting forward, etc. That's where the Russian troops are either positioned on the line or somewhere in the rear, ready to move up and exploit these opportunities. Russia has the resources to exploit the advantageous situation that's going to evolve. Ukraine doesn't have the resources to be able to adequately man this expanding line of contact.
What is the current situation with the Wagner Group? So mainstream media is saying two things. The head of Wagner and Putin are not getting along, and the Wagner troops are not getting along with their superiors. So first, give us a little bit of a picture of Wagner. Our friend, in quotes, Jack Devine, calls it a paramilitary group. I think you're going to argue it's more seriously military than paramilitary, but tell us about it. Who runs it? What's the chain of command? And is there this political tension?
Wagner was created in 2014 when this initial Ukrainian civil war happened between
when Victoria Nuland herself fomented the coup that threw out the popularly elected pro-Russian but popularly elected president of Ukraine.
Viktor Yanukovych, that's right. He fled, and the ethnic Russians were declared to be terrorists by this new neo-Nazi affiliated government. Conflict happened. Russia is prohibited by its constitution to deploy its troops outside of the Russian borders without a declaration of war or some authority given by the Russian parliament. So Wagner was created to be a vehicle through which Russia could provide military assistance. Wagner was a private military company, so any military forces sent to Wagner aren't military, they're private. It was created with a unique funding structure. Mr. Prigozhin was put in charge of this, and Wagner served its role very well. Even when the special military operation started, the Lugansk and Donetsk republics were independent, not Russia. So Wagner continued in this privileged mode, but now attacking in a more concerted fashion. They became a very valuable assault resource, and they had a high priority in terms of the provision of assistance. But when Lugansk and Donetsk became Russian territories after the annexation, after the referendums, Wagner can't exist as a private military corporation anymore legally. So Wagner became a volunteer military unit, and now it is directly reporting to the general staff, and it's part of an expanding Russian force that went from 200,000 to 700,000, which means resources are going to be thinned out. So now Wagner stopped being the only show in town with a priority of resource, and they now become one of many, still a priority, but not getting what it wanted. And so there is some tension there going on. Now, here's my problem with what's going on in the media. I don't know if you remember a while back, there was a video of a defector from Wagner, and they showed him with his head taped to a concrete block, and he confessed his sins, and then a sledgehammer hit him in the head, and because that's the Wagner symbol, the sledgehammer. And everybody said, this is how Wagner deals with traitors and all this stuff. And everybody's like, oh my God, what a horrible organization. Well, then Prigozhin came out afterwards and brought the guy out and said, no, we set this whole thing up. This was all an intelligence ploy for him to get in close, etc. Prigozhin's not a stupid man. Prigozhin knows that he owes everything to Vladimir Putin, literally everything. And that Vladimir Putin, Shoigu, Gerasimov could pull the plug on Prigozhin like that. Prigozhin would disappear. He knows this. So I believe what we're seeing here is a lot of propaganda.
Does Wagner have a chain of command in the traditional sense, which ultimately reports to someone in the Russian military?
Oh, absolutely. Wagner is a military unit, a volunteer unit that has a reporting channel through the various staffs to the general staff. Prigozhin is a civilian who handles the management of this volunteer unit in a way that, a lot of people don't understand. There's a lot of units called BARs. They're volunteer units. Their management is done by the various civilian directors of the regions they come from. So if you're from the Kuban Cossacks, you have a Prigozhin type character back there also helping out. So it's not unique. I just can't believe that Prigozhin is going to sit here and do what he's doing if it weren't some sort of intelligence game to make people think there's problems with Wagner. Meanwhile, what's happening every day? Wagner's stacking the bodies. Wagner's taking the villages. Wagner's killing people. Wagner's advancing. So here on the media, it's playing out that Wagner's falling apart. There's dissension. On the battlefield, Wagner's doing its job. So I have to believe that this is sort of a game that Prigozhin's playing for intelligence purposes.
All right. So while you're on this roll, we have to run this clip of Jack Devine. It's not directly on point, but towards the end of it, he mocks Wagner. Mm-hmm. Take a look. Nobody knows Afghanistan the way you do, Jack, but that was the death throes of the Soviet Union. That was not Putin with a modern army.
Well, first of all, I dispute he has a modern army. He's now demonstrating to the world he doesn't have a modern army. He has a lot of modern weapons. But
he has a more modern army now than Gorbachev had in the Afghan days.
Yeah, but look at what Afghanis had, AK-47s. Look at what technology has done for the Ukrainians and all the sophisticated technology from drones to cyber intelligence. His army is not showing itself very well. It's a surprise to all of us, although this is the second time I've been surprised, because when I went in to do the Afghan program, I was assured they were 10 feet tall, and then every day they shrunk a quarter of an inch. So I think what's showing here, and I think it's the big story, he has paramilitary functioning as his cutting edge because his own army. Now they're fighting. Remember, Judge, you and I talked about dissent and how the things crumble when you start to lose. Watch the dynamic between the Wagner group and the military.
Does our dear friend, who refers to himself as the spy master from his days in the CIA, know what the hell he's talking about?
No, he doesn't. The Russian military is a very modern military with extraordinarily high levels of proficiency proven on the battlefield. You take away the propaganda, and I will tell you, if you take a U.S. Army officer who's professional, forget the propaganda stuff, and he watches how the Russians are fighting, he's going to appreciate the professionalism of the Russian soldiers, the Russian advance, the Russian utilization of artillery, etc. He may say it's not as precise as us, but he'll also say they have a heck of a lot more of it.
Right. Is this a CIA MI6 line that they want to preach to the American media? That the Russian army is not modern, is not sophisticated, is rife with dissension, and is doomed to lose? Because we've heard this from Jack before.
No, he said, look, with all due respect to Jack Devine, I'd love to debate him someday about Afghanistan. Contrary to what he believes, the Russian military wasn't defeated. They didn't leave Afghanistan with their tail between the legs like we did. They left Afghanistan because of a political decision made by Mikhail Gorbachev as part of an overall policy called perestroika and glasnost. And they said, we're just not going to waste resources in Afghanistan. We're leaving. When they left in good order. Their general was large and in charge. Their military was not a defeated military. It wasn't the highest morale in the world. Nobody likes to leave, but they weren't defeated. In fact, Jack, I'll remind you what the reality was on the ground in 1988 for your CIA programs. You were getting beat. The Russians had adapted. The Spetsnaz were hunting down your boys and killing them like flies. The only fighter you had of any viability was Ahmed Massoud in the Panjshir Valley, and even him was pinned in there. So, Jack, the CIA wasn't as good as you think they are, and you're out there blowing smoke up people's you-know-what right now. And the Russians are pretty darn good. They're not perfect. I agree with Jack. I don't want them to be 10 foot tall, but they are about 6'2", and that's pretty big.
Which is the better fighting force? Regular Russian army or Wagner group?
The regular Russian army. The regular Russian army has all the fire support, has all the support. Wagner is a a purpose-built unit right now doing a very difficult job of urban warfare. But it can't do what it's doing without Russian artillery support, Russian air power, Russian electronic warfare, Russian aircraft, with Russian paratroopers and Russian mechanized infantry on their flanks protecting them. Wagner is, they're very good at what they do, but they are not a combined arms combat force.
Is President Putin still under some political pressure from his right to wage a more vigorous and quickly ending war? Is his political stability in office as sound as it was 6 months ago or a year ago?
It's stronger than it's ever been. When you say under political pressure, look, the amazing thing about Russia being a nation at war is the amount of free speech that actually takes place in their airwaves. They have people out there that are critical of the president, critical of the military. They're out there and they're not being shut down. If this was the dictatorship that everybody talks about, the plug would be pulled on all these channels. They're out there able to talk. They can't go out and demonstrate and actively, advance something that's negative to the troops, but they can. There is dissension, there's talk, but that's the element of a free society, which, newsflash to people, Russia is a freer society than, say, Ukraine or other places. But Putin's not under pressure. He doesn't feel any of this political pressure. He listens, as any leader would, but he has a strategic vision, as do his leadership, and they're moving along with that plan, and they're not going to be pushed out of the way by public opinion.
You say that Russia is a freer society than Ukraine. Was there not recently an incident in which an NBC News journalist was targeted for assassination by Ukrainian forces?
Yes, the NBC News journalist went to Crimea to do journalism, where he actually spoke to people on the ground. And as a result, because he was trying to tell the truth, provide a broader perspective, the Ukrainian intelligence services put him on what's called the Mirotvorets list. It's a kill list where people actually are targeted for assassination. Daria Dugina, a Russian journalist, the daughter of Mr. Dugin, who's a big philosopher, nationalist. You don't have to agree with him, but his daughter didn't deserve to die. She was killed, liquidated. I'm on that list. I've been on that list since June of last summer. The bottom line is, if you say anything that is deemed by the Ukrainian government not to be supportive of the narrative they're putting out, not that it's factually wrong. Everything the Ukrainians have accused me of saying is all factually correct. They just don't like the fact that I'm saying it, because by saying it, I'm apparently promoting a pro-Russian narrative, as if.
Right, Scott, I got to stop here. Are any of your friends, like the one speaking to you now, on the list?
Many are. and Judge, I think there's a spot down there for your name on it too. Unfortunately,
I better tell the New Jersey State Police that some of we shouldn't make light of this. What became of the journalist? What became of this fellow? This is a British journalist, a British citizen, a full-time employee of NBC News. Writes articles based on his observations that the Ukrainian intelligence don't like. They publicly put him on the list. What became of him?
Well, he's still employed by NBC, but here's the big question. Where is NBC? Why isn't this the top story on NBC saying, get our guy off the list or we're pulling out? We're not going to be there. Where's the State Department,
which is supposed to protect the health and safety, or at least the safety of Americans in foreign countries, particularly countries with which we are allied, particularly countries that are vassal states of the United States?
Yeah, the State Department actually funds the what's called the Center for Countering Disinformation, which puts out a blacklist. I'm number one on the blacklist, by the way. I'm the number one anti-Ukrainian narrative producing person in the world. They have targeted me to be eliminated, silenced, removed, and it's funded by the State Department. Congress knows about this and yet continues to vote money to pay the salaries of the people who are trying to silence me for carrying out my First Amendment right of free speech.
Last Friday, a week ago today, German Chancellor Scholz visited the White House with the usual fanfare that accompanies a head of state meeting with the president. And then suddenly he and President Biden went off alone in the Oval Office. No translators. The chancellor speaks English, and apparently no aides there. We can guess at what they spoke, because suddenly there appeared on the front page, top of the fold, left-hand column of the New York Times on Monday morning. Oh, the CIA, it's hard for me to say this with a straight face, Scott, found a sailboat
Sailboat.
A sailboat that was in the Baltic Sea about the same time that the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, and they're investigating who on the sailboat might have been involved with blowing up the pipeline. My guess, the chancellor said, Joe, you're killing me. You blew this up without telling us. I'm going to be thrown out of office if you don't come up with some kind of an explanation to counter this guy, Cy Hirsch, because most of my people believe Cy.
It was quite a difficult day yesterday for the whole country, for the whole, for all regions of Ukraine, as this massive attack happened over the night and particularly early in the morning. But in the evening, it was another bad shelling of the city of Zaporizhia. And just to mention, the city of Zaporizhia is located basically in between of Donetsk and Kherson region. So it's kind of in the middle of two front lines. And it has quite a strategic location. And also this is the reason why the shelling of Zaporizhia is happening very often and also intensifies. And what we know from this particular shelling in the evening that bad damages of energy infrastructure, it caused bad damages of energy infrastructure, and thousands of Zaporizhia citizens remain without electricity. Also, very difficult situation with electricity remains in the city of Kharkiv. After yesterday attack, energy infrastructure damages caused outages in the city of Kharkiv, and still thousands of Kharkiv residents remain without electricity. However, the water supply was back. But still, probably these two areas are suffering the most at this point of time from the outcomes of these attacks. In terms of central part of the country, there are some areas which also remain quite tough in terms of energy supply and outages.
What's the latest with Bakhmut? The last we heard, it sounded like it could fall to the Russians. Is that what you're hearing?
Situation in Bakhmut and around Bakhmut remains extremely tough. The Ukrainian armed forces confirmed that situation is very difficult. There is no particularly official confirmation of the fact that Ukrainians are leaving, and for the moment, what we see and what we hear is that it might be that Ukrainian forces are kind of moving the defense lines, but no official information about leaving the city of Bakhmut. So Ukrainian forces, at this point of time, according to official sources, remain in the city. However, there is a certain advance from the Russian forces in that area, especially in the east part of that region of the city of Bakhmut. Also, today, Maxar Technologies images appeared, new images of the area appeared publicly, and we can see from that images that actually the bridges over the main river in the city of Bakhmut are destroyed. And also we can see a lot of damages in the eastern part of the city, which is apparently under Russian control. At least this is what Russian forces announced. Again, we don't have confirmation from Ukrainian side on that, but images demonstrate that east part of the city of Bakhmut is pretty much destroyed, almost completely. What we also hear from Ukrainian officials that definitely the defense of the city of Bakhmut is the longest defense fight, keeping Bakhmut of this full-scale invasion, and gives time for Ukrainian forces to prepare to the upcoming counteroffensive. At least this is what we're hearing here on the ground.
Anna Chernikova reporting for VOA from Kyiv. While there's no knowing when the war in Ukraine will be over, one volunteer organization in western Ukraine called Lviv Knights has been working since 2014 to try to help restore old historical buildings that might have suffered from military action, and at the same time help Ukrainian soldiers by collecting whatever equipment they can. Omilyan El Shudlak has the story from Lviv, Ukraine.
Some wood, an open fire, and a pot means a new roof for an old Ukrainian church. Inside the pot, there's some used motor oil. Tapered pieces of wood are being boiled in the mixture to make them waterproof, turning them into new shingles for the church roof.
My grandfather once taught me that a shingle is worth as much as a loaf of grey bread. We have 22,000 shingles for the church.
Despite the war, entrepreneurs, psychologists, financiers, journalists, students, teachers, architects, restorers and prosecutors gather in the suburbs of Lviv every month to save this wooden church. Since 2013, Andriy Salyuk, together with friends, has been trying to save the church through public donations. To protect the building from moisture, they covered the church with a special film and restored its belfry.
I like to climb the belfry and watch the scenery.
A cloud of black smoke could be seen from the belfry a few days after Russian missiles fell on energy facilities only 10 kilometers from the church. Salyuk's volunteer group, Lviv Knights, started helping Ukraine's armed forces back in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. They sent night vision devices, thermal imagers, binoculars, monoculars, scopes, periscopes, weather stations, drones, and sometimes cars to the front lines. It's not much, Salyuk says, but every little bit helps. Salyuk got his first volunteer experience in 1990 during the Revolution of Granite, one of the first large-scale student protests in Kiev in the Soviet era. Salyuk provided protesters camping in what is now known as Independence Square with tents and sleeping bags. Today he encouraged his social media followers to donate damaged thermal imagers. The Lviv Knights know how to repair equipment.
And when guys call you at 5 a.m. and say, you know, they tried to sneak by us at night, but we noticed them. Otherwise, the 12 of us would not have been alive. You know our efforts are worth it.
From sleeping bags to thermal imagers, whatever is needed. Salyuk says he will work to get it to Ukrainian fighters on the front lines until the war is over. Omeliano Shudlyak for VOA News, Lviv, Ukraine.
Are now facing the end of their permission to stay, known as humanitarian parole, and many say the uncertainty is causing them stress. From the Associated Press, Karen Shamus reports.
About 20,000 Ukrainians are coming to the end of their humanitarian parole. The majority of them arrived in the United States through Mexico. There, it was easier and faster to get a visa to enter the country in the first months following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration has said it is working on a fix, but so far has issued no official guidance on what Ukrainians should do. I'm Karen Chamas.
Russia's war in Ukraine has added to Pakistan's woes as its import-dependent economy has suffered price shocks. 1 year later, Islamabad not only continues to maintain a neutral diplomatic stance on Russia, it's also trying to deepen trade ties with Moscow to acquire cheap energy. Sarah Zaman reports on how Pakistan is walking a diplomatic tightrope in this conflict.
Russia's war in Ukraine derailed Ali Hasnan's plan to acquire an affordable foreign degree in medicine. Hasnan was among hundreds of Pakistani students who fled Ukraine when Russian tanks rolled in.
I am not in touch with anyone in Ukraine because of the conditions there. I applied for admission to med school in Pakistan too, but could not succeed due to the high grades required here.
Russia's war put Pakistan in a difficult position on the world stage. Images of then Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow on the day Russian forces entered Ukraine embarrassed Islamabad. As supply disruptions pushed up food and fuel prices around the world, Pakistan's import-dependent economy, already beleaguered by the COVID-19 pandemic, devastating floods, and mounting debt, faced increasing pressure. Despite calling for peace, Pakistan, like a few dozen other countries, continued to abstain from voting on US-led UN resolutions that condemned Russian aggression.
I think the broader dynamic was that Pakistan wanted to maintain good ties with all major powers. The question arose essentially in the context of US-China competition, but I think the point was well made that we want to have good ties with US, with China, but also with Russia and all other powers.
Driven by growing food insecurity, Pakistan increased wheat imports from Russia. As its neighbor and arch-rival India ramped up cheap energy imports from Moscow to a record high, Pakistan pushed for discounted Russian oil and gas as well. The two sides may reach a formal deal late in March. Ukraine's ambassador to Pakistan, Markian Chuchuk, says Islamabad's policy of staying neutral in the conflict while doing business with Russia is ultimately helping Moscow.
A responsible country should not turn a blind eye to the fact that in doing business with Russia, it may support waging war through oil money.
Ukraine, a major supplier of wheat to Pakistan, saw bilateral trade drop 73% as its exports came under Russian attacks.
If Pakistan condemns Russian aggression against Ukraine, it doesn't mean that it becomes a puppet of the West. That may be a position of a sovereign state.
Chaudhry says Pakistan is exercising autonomy but not taking sides. With the war now in its second year, Pakistan continues to walk a diplomatic tightrope. But Hasnan says he is ready to pick a new path.
I'm quitting the idea of medicine and going to Australia to study business.
With Ali Furqan and Gaitiar Anis, Sara Zaman, VOA News, Islamabad.
Sarah Ashton Cirillo used to be a journalist based in Los Angeles. A transgender woman, she is now a military medic in Ukraine's armed forces. Tatiana Vorozhko met with her in Washington in early December when she came to brief U.S. lawmakers and experts on developments on the front lines.
American Sarah Ashton Cirillo came back to the U.S. for the first time after spending 9.5 months in Ukraine. Ashton Cirillo, a transgender woman and former journalist, originally headed to Ukraine to report on Russia's invasion. She recalled being nervous crossing the Ukrainian border as a transgender woman.
Because there were problems with my paperwork regarding my gender transition, and also I wasn't certain how Ukrainians would deal with having a transgender reporter reporting from the country during war.
Ashton Cirillo says her experience in Ukraine changed her views on how a society can perceive the LGBTQ community.
From the first day when I entered, when I had my passport stamped, I found Ukraine to be welcoming in a very unique way. It's not a question of tolerance. It's not a question of identity. What it is that Ukraine is a nation that appreciates liberty and freedom for all people. And that allowed me to work at an ever higher efficiency as a writer and now as a soldier, due to the fact that my gender identity is a non-issue.
A June analysis published by the U.S. Institute of Peace says while Ukraine has made progress on LGBTQ rights, such as welcoming gay people into its armed forces, more work is needed. Studies indicate attitudes in Ukraine are changing. A 2019 Pew survey in Ukraine said 69% of those polled said homosexuality should not be accepted by society, while 14% said it should be. 3 years later, in May 2022, a survey by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology reported that 64% of respondents said LGBTQ citizens in Ukraine should have equal rights. 26% disagreed. In March, Ashton Cirillo made it to Kharkiv, covering the city and the region for the LGBTQ Nation publication and her Twitter and Substack.
But under President Zelensky and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, what I found is I had more freedom as a reporter in Ukraine under martial law than I would trying to even film the police in the United States.
After seeing the war firsthand, Ashton Cirillo applied to join Ukraine's armed forces.
And then finally, day after day after day of being attacked, made the war personal for me. And due to this, I understood what more could I do? How could I do more in this fight for liberty on behalf of Ukraine than actually be willing to go to the front, not just as a journalist, not just as a civilian working for the Ukrainian government, but as a soldier myself.
Ashton Cirillo has a medical background and was offered work in a medical unit. She was sent to CCC training, a NATO standard medical training course for combat medics, which she passed. She is now waiting to be sent to the front lines as a military medic.
The front lines are a hellacious place. Line 0 is a hellacious place. I've been there when ambulances have been destroyed.
The U.S. Congress passed nearly $45 billion in additional aid for Ukraine, part of a $1.7 trillion spending bill. It now goes to President Joe Biden, who will sign it into law. Ashton Cirillo says Ukraine has already won by showing its bravery and Russia's military impotence. But she hopes the U.S. will continue to help Ukraine reach victory. Tatiana Vorozhko, VOA News, Washington.
Hot soup, some fish and potatoes, salads and desserts. This is what volunteers from the non-profit World Central Kitchen prepared for residents of Irpin in the Kiev region as the war in Ukraine entered its second year. Chef Jose Andres, World Central Kitchen's founder, is here as well.
But yes, it's an anniversary of hope. Obviously, with the visit of President Biden, it's a message of hope.
World Central Kitchen opened meal prep and food delivery points across Ukraine in mid-March 2022. Since then, volunteers have been serving hot meals.
That's why at the end we ended in more than 1,000 towns and cities. We had more than 8,000 food distributions a week. We reached 550,000 hot meals a day. We reach 1.2 million meals on top of that on the form of food bags in places, rural areas with no infrastructure, with no supermarkets.
Russian forces destroyed over 10,000 houses in Irpin last spring, forcing many to move to temporary modular towns. One such town is on the premises of a former sanatorium, and its 300-plus residents, as well as low-income residents of Irpin and Bucha, receive meals daily from World Central Kitchen. For some of them, it is the only way to feed their children.
Our apartment burned down. We lived in a wagon for 6 months, and in late November we moved here.
Music producer Sergei Krivtsov has been volunteering here since June. With the music industry in Ukraine on pause, he spends all his time helping others.
I saw on our friends' Instagram pages they're doing this. I got a chance to help for a few days and then quickly joined the team full-time because they're so good.
Jose Andres says it was a sense of unity and willingness of Ukrainians to help each other that impressed him the most when he came to Ukraine.
Everybody's behind one idea. Everybody's behind President Zelensky. Even people didn't vote for him, they tell you, I didn't vote for him, but he's my president now.
Since the start of the war, Andres has spent over 100 days in Ukraine. He has also visited the deoccupied cities of Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kherson and others.